Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Buddyfight deck profile. So today is going to be a little bit different because it is a deck that's not really a deck, but more of a inclusion in a lot of decks. And that is going to be Lost World. So Lost World can be ran in basically any deck. It goes over the current flag that you have, and then you swap out your main deck for your Lost deck. So depending on what deck you are building, your Lost deck could help reflect that, or your main deck would help set up your Lost deck, so that way when you be lost and go into Lost World, your Lost World can function more appropriately. But Lost World has a whole bunch of different builds. It has a whole bunch of different very good and very powerful cards. And I kind of have laid out like a basic standard, this is what a generic looking Lost World deck would look like. And then, as always, I'll have a section for a whole bunch of other cards you could possibly run, because there's a lot of different and very powerful cards in Lost World. So to start off the deck, I'm going to have 4 copies of Vial Demonic Dragon Vanity Husk Destroyer. This is just a very solid staple for almost any Lost World deck. What he does is, if this card's on your field, your opponent can't gain life. This card on the field can't be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. And then Dimension Door Gate Open. When this card attacks, drop a card on your opponent's field. And then he's got double attack. So he's just very generically powerful. Dimension Gate Open, note it drops it, it doesn't destroy it, it doesn't return to hand, so it bypasses a lot of forms of immunity that a lot of decks tend to rely on. Next, I have 4 copies of Vial Demonic Deity Dragon Vanity Epoch Destroyer. So this is just an upgraded form of Vanity Husk Destroyer, in which its call cost is when a Lost World monster is put from your field to the drop, pay 2 gauge. This card on the field can't be destroyed by your opponent's card effects, so more of the same. And then Dimension Door Impetus. When this card enters the battlefield, choose up to 2 cards on your opponent's field, drop all souls from the chosen card, and put the chosen card into the drop. It's just doing almost the same thing Vanity Husk is doing, except it's not on attack, it's on enter, and it just drops all of the souls and puts the card into the drop, which is very, very powerful. Next, I run 2 copies of Aquinas Dogma. So at the start of your main phase, if this card is in your drop zone, you could pay 1 life. If you do, put this card from your drop zone into your hand. Then he's got a counteract ability. During each player's attack phase, call this card from your hand. So this is just a good recyclable monster. Next, we have 1 copy of Fallen Fang. So what this card does is, its call cost is put a Lost Vader from your drop zone into its soul. All abilities of all cards on the field can't be nullified by your opponent's card effects, so he's a good anti-null card. On top of which, he nullifies all abilities of your opponent's monster in front of this one. And then he's got move, double attack, and soul guard. So he's just a very good anti-nullify and nullify all at the same time. Next, we have 3 copies of Dimension Draw. This is just a very solid draw card. You draw 3 cards and then drop 2 hand cards. So this could have a whole bunch of different synergies depending on what your main deck is, on top of which a good card to discard is like Aquinas Dogma. It's just a very solid draw 3, drop 2. Next, we have 3 copies of Invasion from the Deep and Vial. So you can only cast this if you have a Lost Vader on your field. Look at the top 4 cards of your deck, put 2 of them into your hand, and put the rest into the gauge, and then you can only use it once per turn. This is just one of those generically powerful effects where you just look at the top whatever, and then pick whatever, and then the rest go into the gauge. It's just a very solid standard staple effect in a lot of different worlds. Next, we have 2 copies of Day of Devastation. At counter speed, you get to choose one of the following 2. Either destroy all monsters on your opponent's field and deal 1 damage to them for each monster destroyed, or for this turn, all cards on your field can't be destroyed, returned to hand, and their abilities can't be nullified by your opponent's card effects. Again, you're mostly going to be using this for the second effect, where it just shuts down what the opponent is able to do, but if you're in a very commanding position, the first effect can be pretty good within its own right. Next, we have 2 copies of Dimension Cruelty. So counter, choose one of the following 4. You can either put up to 3 cards from your drop zone into your gauge, stand a card on your field, rest a card on your opponent's field, or drop 2 souls up from a card on your opponent's field. This is just a very powerful card with a whole bunch of different effects, so it's a very good utility type card because it's so flexible depending on the situation. Next, we have 2 copies of Dimension Rune. So at counter speed, you get to choose one of the following 2. Either put a monster from your drop zone into your hand, or choose a Lost Vader on your field. And for this turn, during the battle, if that card attacks alone, your opponent can't counter. It either brings back a Lost Vader or shuts down the opponent's ability to respawn, which is very, very strong. Next, we have 2 copies of Dimension Denial. So this is just the Lost World spell null. You can only cast this when your opponent's casting a spell. Nullify the spell. Very short, simple, and powerful effect. Next, we have 1 copy of Dimension Lifestream. So you can choose one of the following 2, and you can only use Dimension Lifestream once per turn. Either you gain 10 life, or your opponent's life becomes 10. Because with Vanity Husk, they won't be able to gain life, resetting their life if it's already at a high life total to 10 makes it so you put them within lethal range very, very easily, or if you feel like you need to gain some life, gaining 10 life is nothing to scoff at. Next, we have 2 copies of Vial Demonic Particles Lostless Heizer. So this is the best Lost World item that they have, and what it does is the gauge cost written on this equip card is reduced by the number of cards on your field. It reduces its own cost, but its initial equip cost is pay 3 gauge. This card can't be destroyed or leave the field by the opponent's card effects. That's very, very important because it also gets around Time Dragons, because Time Dragons would put it to the bottom, but this card says it can't leave the field. So that's just very strong. And then this card can attack even if you have a monster in your center, and then it has Penetrate and Triple Attack with some very decent stats and a very high crit. This is just their best weapon, hands down, compared to their other ones. And then lastly, for the impact, 2 copies of Vanity Zero Blazer. You can only cast this card if there are 2 or more Lost Vaders on your field, pay 3 gauge, deal 10 damage. So this plays into why we would want to run Dimension Lifestream to set their life at 10, then go into Impact, and then just deal 10. And then if we have Vanity Husk Destroyer, they can't gain any life in response. So it's just a very, very high damage impact for the cost of 3 gauge, which isn't that big of a deal depending on how your main deck is set up. And then there's also ways in Lost World to gain gauge too. So this is kind of like my initial what a generically standard Lost World deck would look like. There are a whole bunch of different builds, and then there's a whole bunch of different like tech options and like just a whole bunch of different options. So I kind of highlighted some of what I felt like were the best options that of other cards you could use, but it all depends on what you can get your hands on, because sometimes Lost World can be very expensive, or it could be hard to find some of the cards, or B, whatever helps support what your main deck was setting up to when you go into Lost World. So to start things off, we have Vial Demonic Husk Deity Dragon Vanity End Destroyer. So you can only call him once per fight. His call cost is if you have 1 or more cards in your hand, put them all into its soul face down. When this card enters the field, put your entire deck into its soul face down. You cannot lose the fight. This card on the field cannot be destroyed, and its abilities can't be nullified, and its souls can't be dropped by your opponent's card effects. So he's a very, very tanky card, on top of which he has the ability Dimension Door Digest, which is at the start of each player's turn, put a soul from this card into your hand. He basically is a deck tutor on top of just a giant beatstick wall that can be very hard to clear. And then he's got triple attack, soul guard, and then if he ever does get destroyed, he has lifelink loss. But what makes him a very powerful option is just he's a good card in general, where you could build your Lost World deck to accommodate his ability, and then you could basically just tutor out anything you want, set up a good board state using his ability, set up a good defensive hand, and then try to win just basically off of this card. Next, we have Vanity Husk Destroyer the Skull. This card can't be destroyed nor rested by your opponent's card effects. Rest spells are very, very prominent right now, so just him not being able to be rested is very powerful in its own right. And then when this card attacks, destroy all cards on your opponent's field. That's just a very generically good and powerful effect, because it will destroy the set spell, it'll destroy the item, and then it'll destroy all of the monsters if they can be destroyed. He only has one attack, which is pretty unfortunate, but the fact that on attack he hits everything and he can't be rested makes up for the fact that he can't attack multiple times, and then you could always subsidize it with some other abilities. Next, we have Vial Demonic Arms Lostless Wall. I think, personally, this is the second best item next to Heizer, just because this is a good defensive item. Your opponent cannot call monsters by card effects, so this just helps shut down, like, oh, during combat I'm going to counter call this into the field and then continue the attack phase, or I'm going to counter call this to block. Like, it just makes it so that they can't call monsters by card effects, which is very powerful. On top of which, it also has a counteract ability. During an attack on your opponent's turn, you may pay 1 gauge if you do nullify the attack, and then it's got double attack. Unfortunately, it can't attack through the center, but most of the time, you don't really care about attacking with the item, even though it does have double attack. It's the fact that you could just pay a gauge to nullify an attack, and then you could do this as many times as you want. It's not a hard block once per turn effect. Next, you could run Cur Fodemond. So when a Lost Fader on your field attacks, destroy a card on your opponent's field and deal 1 damage to the opponent. This is just, again, another very basic on attack, do something, and then he also just so happens to burn the opponent. And then he's got double attack, so you're at least going to attempt to destroy 2 things on your opponent's field, which is just a very powerful effect, and then the burn damage on top of that is always a nice added bonus. Next, you could run Cthugha. This card on the field can't be returned to hand by opponent's card effects, so he can't be bounced. It's not super important, because a lot of the time, like most of the decks that are not really going to be bouncing anyway, but it's still always a good thing to have regardless, just in case. And then at the start of your final phase, you gain 1 life and deal 1 damage to your opponent for each Lost Fader on the field. So that's the part we really care about, because if you have multiple different Cthughas, so if you have 3 Cthulhas on your field and then the item and the set spell, on final phase, each Cthugha is going to be triggering, burning the opponent for 5, and then you'll be gaining 5 because you'll have 3 different Cthugha triggers for 5. So this card is a very powerful way to burn the opponent out, and it's a very good card to include in like a budget option, because it's a common and it's just a very cheap and effective card. You could be running Emule Catarant, so your opponent can't draw by monster effects. It helps shut down some of the draw options the opponent can have. And then on top of that, when this card is destroyed, you could pay 1 gauge. If you do, return this card to your hand. So it's another recursive monster, and all it really is doing is shutting out the opponent's ability to draw by monster effects. It's already kind of good in its own right, just being a recursive monster. Next, we have Flourishing of Nihility and Desperation. So its call cost is put 7 cards from your drop zone into its soul. It's a set spell, and then it has a counter ability. During an attack on your opponent's turn, drop a soul from this card. If you do, nullify the attack. The really important thing about this card is it's a set spell and it helps stop attacks. So it combos really well with Cthugha because you could have multiple of these set spells active at one time, and then that increases Cthugha's damage output. And then on top of which, if they're just trying to attack and they don't have a way to destroy the set spell, you have 7 different attacks you can nullify, and it's not hard blocked once per turn on the effect. So if they're just going to constantly bombard you with attacks, you could just basically get rid of all of the souls on this card to just whittle down the attacks and nullify them all. It's also a very cheap and budget friendly card at the common rarity. It's a really solid card for budget builds, and it combos with Cthugha, so that way you can have multiple different set spells, multiple different Cthughas, an item, and then you'll basically just have this wall where you just sit there and burn the opponent to death. You could also run Dimension Revive. Call a monster from your drop zone by paying its call cost. For this turn, that monster gets +2 crit. So it's just a good way of bringing back any Lost Vader that got destroyed that you really want to see on the field. And then the 2 crit, depending on what the monster is, can be pretty important because they already have such a high crit and multiple attacks, so you could try to push for even more damage with this card. You could also run Dimension Breeding, so you can only cast this card if you have 2 or more Lost Vaders on your field. You put the top 2 cards of your deck into your gauge, gain 2 life, and draw 2 cards, and then you can only use it once per turn. So this is just a very generically good draw spell that also gains you gauge and gains you life. You could also run Vial Vortex. Vial Vortex is kind of an interesting card because what it does is for this turn, all call casts and call costs and equip costs of cards in your hand are lost. Basically, you could just play anything for free. So you don't have to worry about call cost conditions, cast cost conditions, equip cost conditions. None of that really matters when you play this card. This can help set up a whole bunch of different plays, and it's just a very interesting card that combos with a lot of different cards. One of the cards it combos with, and a very, very powerful card, is Episto Ira Gintz. So its call cost is pay 10 gauge, but with Vial Vortex, you don't really have to pay that. You just play it. But even paying 10 gauge, depending on your main deck, might not even be a problem. But that all depends on your main deck. So this is one of those more like optional cards where depending on how your main deck is and your lost deck is, you could probably easily squeeze this card in. But what this card does is when this card enters, put up to 5 cards from your drop zone into its soul. You cannot take damage by monster effects, and then this card on the field can't be rested, its crit can't be reduced by your opponent's card effects. It has move, penetrate, triple attack, soul guard, and counter attack. So it's just a very, very powerful card that is doing a whole lot to protect you and a whole lot to protect it because it can't be rested, so that way its damage really can't be easily prevented. Next, you could run Lost Cross Astrologia. So its call cost is put a card from your drop zone into its soul and pay 2 gauge. Then if you have 3 or more Lost Vaders on your field, all cards get +2 crit, penetrate, and counterattack. The counterattack isn't super relevant, but it's not bad considering a lot of Lost Vaders have very tanky stats and they're highly overstated most of the time, but that's like the whole gimmick of Lost World. But the +2 crit and penetrate can matter a lot because they have such high crit and not all of them have penetrate, and this is a way to give them all penetrate only if you control 3 or more. But considering you have multiple different ways of protecting them, it's not the hardest thing to run, and this card in his own right can be also another win condition depending on how you set up your board. And then on top of which he himself has double attack and soul guard. Next we have Gargantuan Lost Dragon. Its call cost is put a card from your drop zone into its soul and pay 2 gauge. It has a counteract ability. During your turn, call a Lost Vader from your hand on top of this card by paying its call cost. If this card is in a monster's soul, it gets soul guard, and then he has double attack and soul guard himself. So he's more of like a option card to try to extend attacks, where the idea is you swing with him twice for double attack, use his counteract ability, call another Lost Fader on top of him, and then you could swing for more attacks. So he's just really an attack extender, and depending all on like what you're trying to do with your Lost World deck, he might be a good option, or he just might not even see any play. Next we have our pal Pydural. So its call cost is put 2 cards from your drop zone into its soul and pay 1 gauge. Then he has Penetrate, Counterattack, Double Attack, and Soul Guard. So he's keyword soup. That's really all he is. He's a very easy keyword soup card play, and with cards like Lost Cross, his crit increases, and then he just becomes an even more powerful threat. And then lastly, you could run Dugain Zen Scythe. So its call cost is pay 1 gauge. When this card enters the field, nullify all abilities of a card on your opponent's field and destroy it, and then he's got double attack. Being able to nullify something and destroy it is just pretty powerful. That's really the only reason why you're going to be running him, is just for that ability. That's kind of my whole take on Lost World. It's a very interesting concept and mechanic. Initially, I really liked the mechanic because it was something new and different, and then as it got more and more support, it just became more and more powerful with a whole bunch of different options in deck styles you can make and run, and it has a whole bunch of different flexibility depending on what your main deck is and how you want to build your Lost World deck. I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe if you want to see more Buddyfight content like this, and I will see you in the next video.